Oh, say can you see by the dawn's early light, which so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous flight, o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave. The poem goes on, but that is the part that every American knows as the Star-Spangled Banner, our national anthem, written by Francis Scott Key in 1814. Fort McHenry was built in 1798, a star-shaped fort. It guarded Baltimore Harbor from enemy ships. The Napoleonic Wars began in 1803 against the First French Empire commanded by Napoleon Bonaparte. It was a world war with a large loss of life. Millions were killed in the wars. During the war, the British began boarding American vessels and impressing sailors into the Royal Navy, which was severely understaffed due to the war. This angered almost all Americans. The British also imposed trade restrictions on America during this time, as well as the French. America was trying to stay neutral and trade with both major superpowers. Americans began calling for war. Well, some Americans. Many in New England did not want war with Britain. Their livelihood relied on trade with Britain and Canada, which was a British colony. But the cries for war made their way across America, and President Madison knew that it would be up to Congress to decide. He wrote to Congress laying out America's grievances for Britain and left the decision for war for Congress to decide. The House voted 79 for war, 49 against war, 61% in favor of war. The Senate voted 19 for war, 13 against war. 59% voted for war. A close vote, but it was final. The young nation would be declaring war against Great Britain. The war did not go well at first for the Americans. One of the first engagements was the sacking of Fort McHenry. Lieutenant Porter Hanks was commander of the fort. The British arrived at the fort with 600 men versus his 61 men. He surrendered without a fight, fearing a massacre from the native warriors fighting with the British. One of the leading causes of the 1814 Battle of Baltimore started with the American victory at the Battle of York over a year earlier. 1,700 Americans sailed across Lake Ontario and landed on the banks of York, the capital of Upper Canada, modern-day Toronto. A battle ensued while the American ships bombarded Fort York and the gun batteries protecting York. As the soldiers approached the fort and fired on the fort with muskets and cannons, the British commander, Roger Sheaffe, ordered his regulars to retreat from the fort and blow up the fort's magazine. The U.S. troops had no idea. They were 200 yards from the fort when the magazine exploded. The magazine had 300 barrels of gunpowder and a large amount of shells. The explosion threw debris towards the Americans over 500 yards from the fort. Brigadier General Pike and 37 other American soldiers were killed in the blast. Hundreds more were wounded. The town surrendered. Many American soldiers began looting the town and stealing from homes and buildings. They set fire to government buildings. This would prove to be a very bad decision later on. The U.S. would suffer for the burning and looting of York. A year later, the British took aim on the mid-Atlantic region of America during the Chesapeake Campaign. Napoleon had been defeated, and now the British could send their troops to America and Canada. Rear Admiral Cockburn, who was stationed in the Chesapeake, wrote to his superior, Vice Admiral Cochrane, asking to attack inland, stating that the cities were vulnerable. Vice Admiral Cochrane suggested Washington, Baltimore, and Philadelphia. Cockburn chose Washington, the nation's capital, a young city. George Washington chose the location of the city himself in 1790. Cochrane wrote to Cockburn and gave him orders. You are hereby required and directed to destroy and lay waste such towns and districts as you may find assailable. Washington was now in British crosshairs. The British landed at Benedict. The Americans were defeated at the Battle of Bladensburg, a short distance from Washington. The cannon fire could be heard from the city. President Madison was at the battle, watching from a distance. His wife Dolly Madison was still at the White House, preparing a meal for her husband, waiting on him to return home. Her guards had already fled. Dolly salvaged what she could, most importantly, the painting of President Washington, having to break the frame to save the painting. It was disputed that Dolly was the one who saved the painting. President Madison's personal slave claimed that she only grabbed the valuables, and that the doorkeeper John Seuss and gardener McGraw were the ones who actually saved the painting. But history remembers Dolly Madison as the savior of President Washington's painting. Dolly eventually fled Washington and met with her husband right before the British arrived. August 24, 1814, the British entered the city and met little resistance. The Capitol building was the first to be looted. An expenditure book from 1810 was taken by Rear Admiral Cockburn as a souvenir. It was eventually returned to the United States in 1940. The Capitol's south wing was burned. The fire spread but did not completely destroy the Capitol. Some of it was salvaged. The contents of the Library of Congress were destroyed. The wood floors, walls, and furniture burned, but the stone survived. After the Capitol building, the British headed for the White House. It is said that the British ate the dinner prepared for the president's return and drank their wine. Many believed the burning of Washington was a direct result of the Americans burning the Upper Canada capital of York. Cockburn ordered the building that housed the newspaper, the National Intelligencer, burned because they wrote badly about him. But nearby residents pleaded that their homes would catch fire if the building was burned. He ordered it tore down instead. The U.S. Treasury and the U.S. War Department were also burned. While the British were trying to destroy gunpowder left behind at Fort McHenry, it exploded, killing many soldiers in the process. President Madison watched the city burn from off in the distance that night. The British kept adding fuel to the fires to ensure the buildings were destroyed. A freak storm hit Washington a few days later. It is said that a massive thunderstorm, or possibly a hurricane, drenched the city, damaging some of the British ships in the process. A tornado hit the Capitol building and killed British troops and civilians. The storm put the fires out, and then the British retreated back to their ships. The burning of Washington caused over $40 million in damage with inflation in 2024. Baltimore had a large, deep port, and many privateers were based in Baltimore and were raiding British ships. The British planned to have a land invasion at North Point led by Major General Ross. Vice Admiral Cochrane would lay siege to Fort McHenry. Baltimore had been expecting an attack, and George Armistead, the fort's commander, wanted a large flag. He stated, "A flag so large that the British would have no difficulty seeing it from a distance." An order was put in for two flags to be made, the Great Garrison flag and the smaller Storm flag. In 1813, Mary Pickersgill was commissioned to sew the flags. She was paid $405.90. She made the flag at Brown's Brewery on East Lombard Street. It would have been the largest flag to have ever been flown at the time. The flag flew over Fort McHenry. Major General Samuel Smith was in charge of Baltimore's defenses. A mile of trenches were dug to protect the city with 100 cannons, while Fort McHenry protected the harbor. September 11, 1814, the British fleet was spotted approaching North Point. The British landed 5,000 troops at North Point September 12th, and they marched towards the city. They met heavy resistance. The Battle of North Point began 3,000 U.S. militia against 5,000 British redcoats. The Americans did not have any canister shot. They loaded nails and scrap metal into cannons to improvise. Major General Ross was killed by a U.S. sniper. This left the British without a leader until Colonel Arthur Brooke took command. He was known as a cautious commander. The Maryland militia in Baltimore put up a much stronger defense than at Washington 2 weeks earlier. While the battle was raging, defenses were being improved at Baltimore. The next day, the British headed toward Hampstead Hill. A mile of trenches, 100 cannons, and 10,000 regular and a few thousand militia troops met the British. The British attack, supported by a few naval ships with artillery. The battle raged, and the British took the outer defenses. But they had some success against the inner defense. But the British decided to return to the ships and bombard Fort McHenry before taking the city. They did not want to risk the casualties from a full frontal assault. They underestimated Baltimore's defenses. The bombardment of Fort McHenry commenced. 19 British warships, 2 miles away, pounded the fort with 190 to 200 pound mortar shells, 10-inch and 13-inch mortars, as well as British rockets. Francis Scott Key was a Washington lawyer in Baltimore, on a truce ship to obtain the release of his friend, a prisoner of war, Dr. William Beans, from the British. He successfully obtained his release from the British and returned to his ship, but he was not allowed to return to Baltimore. At sunrise, Key witnessed the massive stars and stripes raised above the fort. Francis Scott Key had been against war and he was not very political, but he witnessed the 25-hour bombardment of Fort McHenry, and he wanted desperately for his country to win the battle. The British fired up to 1,800 mortars at Fort McHenry over 25 hours. The British could not get past the fort and into the harbor due to purposefully sunken ships that the Americans had blocked the harbor with. The British had to fire from 2 miles away. Their cannons had a maximum distance of 2 miles. It made it nearly impossible to accurately aim. The rockets also had a range of just 1.5 miles. Francis Scott Key waited for morning, desperately hoping that the American flag was still flying over the fort. The storm flag had been flying during the battle. At dawn, the 30 by 42 foot Great Garrison flag was raised over the fort. Francis Scott Key saw the American flag still flying over the fort and began to write his thoughts into a poem. The British fleet retreated. They failed to reach Baltimore. Francis Scott Key reached Baltimore, and that night in his hotel he finished his poem and called it Defense of Fort McHenry. It would later be called the Star-Spangled Banner. Within a week it was printed in papers, and it was spread across the country. In 1931, it became the national anthem. Peace treaties were agreed in December 1814. Congress ratified the peace treaty February 17, 1815, ending the War of 1812. Not much changed after the war. The borders were the same, and the Napoleonic Wars were now over, so the U.S. did not have to worry about impressments anymore. It is a war that many forgot about. Not as well known as the Revolutionary or Civil War, but it is a part of American history, and many battles were fought throughout the war. Casualties were low compared to other wars at the time, and America and Britain would not have another bloody war against one another. The last war between the pair was a bloodless war known as the Pig War in 1859. I hope you enjoyed this one, folks. I've always been fascinated with Fort McHenry. I've visited it many times. I've been to a lot of forts, and McHenry is beautiful, absolutely gorgeous. A wonderful fort, and if you're ever in Baltimore, you should absolutely visit it. Thank you for watching, folks. I hope you enjoyed, and we will see you on the next. Peace.